Good evening, everybody. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm Edward Harcourt. I'm the Academic Director of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and I'm here to bid you a warm welcome to this year's Royal Institute of Philosophy Edinburgh Lecture, which is brought to you by the Royal Institute in enthusiastic collaboration with the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And let me begin by saying how grateful I am to the Royal Society for the helpful and approachable and can-do attitude that they've displayed throughout the year. You're great people to work with, thanks to the whole team. So now, a few housekeeping remarks before we begin. First of all, the session's being live-streamed. And secondly, and I'm kind of hoping that at this point the slide is going to change, but there we are. Thank goodness for that, because there's a little bit to remember. No fire drills are scheduled. So in the very unlikely event that the fire alarm goes off, it's the real thing. Keep calm, file out of that door all the way to the entrance by which you came in, turn right on George Street and assemble outside the dome. And that's all I have to say by way of housekeeping. So now on to the good bit. It's a great pleasure to have with us this evening our speaker, Professor Carrie Jenkins. Carrie is Canada Research Chair and Professor of Philosophy at the University of British Columbia. She's held visiting positions, among other places, at St Andrews, the Australian National University, and the University of Michigan. She has wide-ranging, perhaps unusually wide-ranging, philosophical interests, which range from a 2008 monograph, Grounding Concepts and Empirical Basis for Arithmetical Knowledge, to Sad Love, Romance and the Search for Meaning, which came out last year, and her latest work of philosophy, Non-Monogamy and Happiness, is literally hot off the press, came out in November 2023. Notwithstanding her many academic distinctions, she describes herself on her website as philosophy's crazy ex-girlfriend, perhaps because she's recently branched out into fiction, and her novel Victoria Sees It was published by Penguin Random House and shortlisted for the Ethel Wilson Fiction Prize. I could go on, but you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to Carrie, so let's give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you so very much, Edward, for those kind opening remarks, and thank you all for being here. I'm incredibly honored and slightly jet-lagged right now. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about this guy. This is Bertrand Russell. He, like me, had unusually wide-ranging philosophical interests. They spanned, like mine, mathematical logic and the philosophy of romance and relationships. So what I wanted to talk about in connection with him right now is something that happened to him in 1940 when he was living in the States and he needed to make a bit of money. And so he applied to a teaching position at the City College of New York. By this time in his career, he was a renowned academic, not only a philosopher, a very well-known mathematical logician, but he was also a very well-known public intellectual. So the college thought they were in with a slam dunk hiring him, but there was a big public outcry about his appointment, and there were protests, and in the end his job was denied. There was actually a legal ruling that he was morally unfit to teach at the college. Now, to be fair, Bertie was not one to shy away from controversy on pretty much every subject. He was a pacifist in wartime. He was advocating for the rights of queer people when it was extremely unusual to do so. He was also busy going around advocating for and openly himself participating in non-monogamous romantic relationships. Again, a bit like me. We also share the same college in Cambridge. We're both from Trinity College, Cambridge. It's a little weird when you think, oh, what's this guy? I'm sort of following Bertrand Russell's life around, but he's also not like me in quite a lot of ways. Maybe we'll come back to some of those later. Anyway, his critique of traditional relationship norms and rules was considered deeply inconsistent with American core values at the time in 1940. And so he was not allowed near people's kids at the college. And not that they would have been children, but the same kind of public outcry whenever someone's involved in education seems to arise. So I wanted to ask this question. That was 1940. This is now, 2023. Has the dial moved much? How are public reactions to somebody doing this kind of thing changing? How are they not changing over time? I'll give a bit of a content warning for the next slide, which is about my experience of trying to discuss philosophically and personally my experiences with and my thoughts about romantic relationships, including some that are non-conventional. So here's a charming commentator from one of my YouTube videos describing me in some, really, really hate-filled ways and some quite violent ways. But the headline news here, what I really wanted to call attention to, apart from the fact that this person doesn't seem to know what end of story means, apart from that, what I notice is this appeal to American values is still really prominent in the subjection to what I'm saying about promoting polyamory, having more than one romantic partner, talking openly about challenges to the conventional wisdom that tells you there's only one right way to love. So that apparent conflict with American values is still there. But what I'm really interested in doing with stuff like this was not the only piece of feedback of this nature that I received when I started talking about this stuff in 2017, which is when my book, What Love Is and What It Could Be, came out. What I think it shows us is not just that it's rough being on the internet, but it shows us something under the hood. And I really want to kind of use this little bit of time with you to help lift the hood a little and show some of the mechanisms that work behind the scenes when we get into this kind of comment on romantic love and the norms around it. Why this bothers people so much, right? Why does it bother people so much to say there could be other ways to do romance, to do love? Maybe it's not all happy ever after, prince and princess. Maybe there's other life stories that are good life stories. That really bothers people. And so I'm going to be talking about what the connection is, as I see it, with some of these references to America. Second Amendment rights, particularly terrifying. That's the right to carry firearms, in case anyone was wondering what he's up to there. This article that the person's referring to at the beginning here, this article, I Have Multiple Loves, at the chronicle.com website, is actually a story in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It was an interview that I did with a brilliant journalist and economist called Maura Weigel. And it came out, it was actually made the cover story of the Chronicle. And so this photo was on the cover. Not the best photo of me ever, not the most flattering image, but no, it's okay. And these people are my then husband and my then boyfriend. And in the article, I talked about a little bit about my work, a little bit about my life. And it was published with this headline. Can Carrie Jenkins make polyamory respectable? So polyamory is a word for openly, consensually engaging in more than one loving romantic relationship at the same time. And this headline, there's so many things going on here, and I'll just comment on a couple of them. Firstly, it's a reminder that it currently isn't, right? It's not respectable now, so maybe I can make it respectable. But the other thing that I wanted to call attention to is whether that's really the struggle. Is respectability what I'm even asking for? I did not write that headline. I doubt even that Moira Weigel wrote that headline. Typically, journalists don't get to write their own headlines. I was advocating for respect, but respectable is a really strange, double-edged word. And the other thing I would say about this is, a general rule of journalism is that if the headline is a question, the answer is no. Because if the answer was yes, they would have just said the thing. And if they can't say the thing, they'll ask the question. And so, of course, I can't make polyamory respectable. No one person can do something like that. Right? This is something that goes much deeper than what I or anyone else has to say on the matter individually. But it can be done if we want to do something like that. Again, I'm not sure that's exactly what we're trying to do, but the norms around romantic relationships can and do change. In my lifetime, I've seen radical, dramatic change around attitudes to queer relationships, for example. And I continue to do what I do, which is to talk about romantic love in ways that some people find challenging and surprising, despite getting this kind of feedback, because I think it's meaningful, because I think it matters, and because I think change is possible, and because I think there's so much more that hangs on this question of how to love than meets the eye. And that brings us back to why it bothers people so much when you challenge the norms of love. I was invited to go on a podcast called The Grey Area, run by Vox. And this was quite recently after the publication of Sad Love. And in Sad Love, this is one of my more recent books, I talk about my experience when I started to get those hateful messages, a lot of hate mail in my inbox, lots of quite threatening, scary stuff. I went into a bit of a depression. I was struggling with my mental health for a while. I was sad. I was sad a lot of the time. I was kind of angry sometimes, but mostly sad. And I, being a philosopher of love, at that time, I've been thinking about love for quite a while. It's hard to switch that off. So I was still thinking, well, love, so many messages tell us it's supposed to be the happy ever after. Happy ever after is the success condition for a romantic relationship. If you want to ask if someone's relationship is going well, you ask, are you happy with that person? Or does the person make you happy? So I wasn't happy. So I started worrying. Does this mean I'm unlovable? Or does it mean that I'm unloving? Because love is about happiness. So I started mining that question, and Sad Love emerged. And I'll talk more about what it ended up saying as we go along. But I got invited onto Vox to the Grey Area podcast to talk about it. And Sean Illing, the host, said something that I really appreciated. And so I wanted to kind of bring that to you. So he said, I think this is what makes your critique of romantic love so much deeper than it might appear. It's really a critique of our whole political and economic paradigm and how that has shaped our inner lives to the point that it has touched and colored our understanding of love. And I said, thanks for noticing. That is actually what I'm trying to do. And so when he says that, he's talking about the way that I try to dismantle, in that book, I try to dismantle the romantic idea, or I might say ideology, of happy ever after. Happy ever after is, it's only part of the picture. There's actually an entire bundle of ideas about romance and how to live a good life full of love and happiness that are tied up to that idea. Okay, so I'm going to start today's more substantive talk by sort of outlining, sketching that received wisdom, and then we'll try to dive back under the hood again and see what's going on there. So received wisdom. Again, another word for this could be an ideology. A good life is one full of love and happiness. A bad life is one with neither of those things. The best things in life, i.e. love and happiness, are free. Don't have to pay for them. No money involved. Anyone can succeed in life. To live a good life, you should pursue love and happiness instead of pursuing crass things like wealth, power, or fame. And, so far so innocuous sounding, maybe. Yeah, sounds very good. And then there's this fourth one, not so often said out loud, but still really important. Romantic love is the most important kind of love. It leads to your happy ever after. It will define the shape of your good life. How do we know romantic love is the most important kind of love? Well, when someone gives you a +1 to bring along a person, they expect you to bring a romantic partner. We kind of expect by default that romantic partners will take precedence over family, over friendships, and other kinds of connections. And we kind of assume, although we shouldn't, we must stop doing this, that people who don't have a romantic relationship are looking for one. And they would like to have one if they only could, and there's something missing from their lives. Actually, one difference between me and Bertrand Russell is that he was very much signed up for that opinion. I'm very, very much not signed up for that opinion. But let's go back to the first three for a second. What I want to call attention to is that love and happiness are being cast in these kind of twin roles as definitive of a good life. It's almost like they're being conflated into being the same thing. And so I think it's not a coincidence that we tend to end fairy tale romantic stories with, and they lived happily ever after. Happiness is achieved through following the romantic script. The romantic script, incidentally, is something that most of us learn very early in life, and a very early form of it is actually taught to kids in the playground when we tell them how to do this little rhyme, so-and-so and so-and-so sitting in a tree, Kissing. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby in a baby carriage. Right? That is a life script. And once it's internalized, which happens, as I'm saying, at a very young age, typically before all of our BS detectors are fully online, it's in there. And we are living with that idea of how to live for the rest of our lives, even if we challenge it later, right? Even if we become aware later that there might be other ways to live. Meanwhile, sadness in love is depicted in all over popular culture and, high literature as this kind of tragic failure condition, right? It's explosive, it's intense, it's overwhelming, it's deadly. Sad love is Romeo and Juliet. Sad love is Wuthering Heights, La Traviata, Anna Karenina, right? It's going to kill you. So romantic love comes in two flavors: best thing ever, happy ever after, or your worst nightmare, an absolute tragic disaster. Okay, so these are the ideas that we're all swimming in every day, all the time. What is going on with these under the hood? What are they doing? How are they directing our lives? They become ideals, and the thing about ideals is that even if we know they're not realistic, okay, of course we know happy ever after, not realistic. Everybody knows that. They're still powerful because they are still a measure, a standard against which we can measure ourselves. So when I say that we live in the shadow of the romantic ideal, what I'm saying is that there is this standard of happy ever after that we are all failing to meet. Everyone is failing to meet it. And that doesn't mean that we drop the standard, right? It just means that we judge ourselves. And that's, I think, a problem. But there's more to this as well. We're going to keep digging. There's more to this even than that. And I like to use a metaphor here of a bowling alley. So if you imagine yourself standing at one end of the bowling alley with your ball in your hand, and you can see the pins at the far end. There are 2 gutters on either side that'll stop your ball from rolling off too far one way or the other. And actually, in the ideal version of this picture, they'd be filled in with those inflatable bumper things that people like me need when they're bowling, because I'm rubbish. They would have those bumpers in there to make sure your ball ends up going back down in this direction. So what I use this analogy for is to say, well, we get told that you mustn't have more than one romantic partner. That's too many. You mustn't have less than one romantic partner. That's not enough. You must have exactly one romantic partner. And you must follow that trajectory of life to the conclusion, which is the nuclear family, right? Yeah, go the last step of the rhyme, which is then comes baby in a baby carriage. So how do these bumpers work? How do they keep us kind of headed back over here? Well, we tell each other that this is the only way to be happy. This is happy ever after. And over here, non-monogamy will make you miserable. I know someone who tried that. They were very unhappy. This person over here, oh, spinster, that sounds like a terrible thing to be. Like, we don't have happy spinsters in literature, right? We have Miss Havisham and Miss Gulch and Lily Bart and Sister Carrie. We don't have stories of how great it can be to live with 0 romantic partners. We don't have many stories of how great it can be to live with 2 romantic partners either. We just have lots of fairy tales, and they all have the same configuration. So what's happening is that we're raising a specter of unhappiness as a way to police non-monogamy and police singlehood, living without a romantic partner. It's a tactic to keep us all on the same path towards the same destination, which is the nuclear family. Okay, and I have to warn you about the next slide, which is really scary. Okay. The nuclear family is a structure, and a society organized into nuclear families is a society that is amenable to capitalism. And it is one that conservatives, with both large and small c's, are fond of. Good old Margaret Thatcher did not believe in society, but she did believe in individuals and she did believe in families. Under capitalism, an individual is a consumer. A nuclear family is a slightly larger consuming unit, still a slightly larger individual, bound with the metaphorical or sometimes literal white picket fence. That unit is not necessarily a threat to the social order that folks like Maggie would like to see, right? A community could be a threat. A social support network could be a threat. A labor union could be a threat. A nuclear family is not a threat. So it is conservative policy, both in the UK, and in the US and in Canada, where I live now, to keep traditional family values the way they are. And this is part of why critiquing them is challenging on a much bigger level than just talking about somebody's private life. This is an area where the personal is definitely very, very political as well. So how does this policing work, right? Why does raising the specter of becoming unhappy keep us on the straight and narrow? It works because when it comes down to it, we're scared of being sad. Right? We're scared of the so-called negative emotions, like sadness or anger, like fear. We're afraid of fear itself. And this too is something I want to question. When I went into my period of depression, when I was experiencing a lot of sadness, I started to ask questions like, well, is this really, the worst thing in life? Sadness? It wasn't the operatic tragedy. It wasn't disaster. It wasn't explosive or technicolor sadness. It was black and white, grayscale, day-to-day rough sadness. But the reason it was happening was because of the work I was doing, and the work I was doing was really meaningful to me. So I asked myself, should I just stop doing this work? Probably be a bit happier, a bit less sad. And I said no, because the work is meaningful. My sadness is not the end of the world if it enables me, if it's part of doing this thing that I want to do. Asking a bundle of questions around that, I started asking, what does happiness really have to do with love anyway? Am I now incapable of doing love right because I'm sad? And then I started going back over that received wisdom that put love and happiness in these twin roles as, the two great positive emotions, the things that we're supposed to aim for in life. And I started wondering, is love even a positive emotion at all? A lot of psychologists sort of start out by assuming that it is an emotion, and a positive one at that. Some philosophers do as well, although philosophers have more range of opinions on that question. But the received wisdom that makes love and happiness more or less the same thing certainly seems to be positioning it as something positive and something emotional, something we feel. And I wanted to ask, well, couldn't love be something that makes room for the full range of human emotions, including sadness, including fear and anger? Why do we have to be happy in order to be loving well? And I kept asking questions. I'm a philosopher. We do this. And I got to this one. Is happiness such a great life goal in the first place? Right? It sounds so innocuous, right? The pursuit of happiness. Go after your happiness. Chase your happy. Of course, we say those things and we mean well. But are we really giving each other such great advice when we do that? And this was where I ended up digging really deep into the connection with American values. Because the pursuit of happiness is something that's really baked into the American self-conception, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, right? So obvious you don't need an argument for it. Self-evident truths. All men are created equal. They kind of do mean men at that time as well. That they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's right up there with life and liberty, and you know how much Americans love liberty. So it's pretty big deal. Now, I'm not the first person to notice this. So here's another person who noticed it. Back in 1946, Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist and a therapist, also a concentration camp survivor. And he said, to the European, it is characteristic of the American culture that again and again one is commanded and ordered to be happy. But happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. And that last part is really interesting. Happiness cannot be pursued. It doesn't work that way. In 1946, Frankl might have been right that most Europeans would find it very surprising and very American. But the more that American culture has dominated the world, the more this has kind of become everybody's problem. And, of course, the chumminess of Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 80s is part of the story of how we get from here to there, or from there to here. But that idea that happiness cannot be pursued is one that philosophers have been thinking about for a little while. So, tiny bit of background on that. So here's John Stuart Mill in 1873. He actually wrote about this in his autobiography. So he says, while he's reflecting on his own life, and he said, those only are happy who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness, on the happiness of others, on the improvement of mankind, even on some art or pursuit, followed not as a means, but as itself an ideal end. Aiming thus at something else, they find happiness by the way, which is basically what Frankl's saying. Happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue. There are a couple of other statements of this. Henry Sidgwick at around the same time as Mill. And then more recently, some empirical research by psychologists that seems to confirm the same thing, that people who went around valuing happiness, who said they were trying to be happy, were actually more likely to be less happy. So that's what the lower hedonic balance means, not as happy. Less psychological well-being, and it made them less satisfied with their lives. And they experienced higher levels of depression symptoms, the people valuing happiness more. So if that's right, that's a bit of a paradox. If we try to pursue happiness, it makes us not very happy. Then you might think, well, okay, so the solution is don't pursue happiness, which is all well and good until we start trying to look for an alternative, positive understanding of a good life. What else could a good life be? That's where things get tricky. En route to it, we're going to have to encounter another problem with overvaluing happiness and excluding the value or wisdom in the negative emotions, which is what's coming now to be known as toxic positivity. Toxic positivity, also known as the good vibes only attitude, tells you that it's wrong to be sad, it's wrong to be angry, it's wrong to be afraid, that you must live with gratitude, you must exhibit grit, and sometimes even will gaslight you and say things like, well, it's not that bad, other people have it much worse than you, stop complaining. Many things are wrong with this, including telling people to stop complaining when they have good cause to complain is really a kind of victim blaming. It's also, again, just lifting the hood a little bit, a very politically conservative thing to do, because the people complaining are the people who are going to change the way things are. And if you tell people not to complain, put it this way, you can't have a revolution with good vibes only. That doesn't happen. So again, the way that happiness is valued and exalted can become toxic, not just to individuals, but also at a larger societal level by stifling complaint, by stifling structural and political factors that can lead people to feel bad and not good, and then for them to be able to speak up against those factors, those influences. All right. So, in the search for an alternative conception of the good life, I again tried turning back to the history of philosophy, and in this case, the ancient history of philosophy, because people have been thinking about this for a while. I'm not the first person to notice that there might be value to understanding what a good life could be in ways that are not just defined by being happy. And Aristotle had a theory. He had a theory, and he used this word, eudaimonia, to describe what a good life has, what a good life has lots of. And people translate Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia as something like well-being or flourishing, which is, so far so uninformative. But when he gets into the details of his theory, it turns out it's actually determined by what species you belong to. It has a lot to do with being virtuous. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to achieve if you're ugly, because part of eudaimonia requires you to be attractive to other people in a way that is conducive to reproduction of your species. So let's not worry too much about Aristotle's theory. What I did instead was I looked at the word itself and its etymology, which Aristotle kind of ignores, actually. So the word itself is made up of two root words, eu, which means good, the same kind of eu as in euphemism or euphoric or eulogy, and daimon, which means a supernatural entity or a spirit. Now, originally, that could be any kind of supernatural being. It could be anything from a sort of a demigod down to a personal guardian angel looking after you. But eudaimonic really means good-spirited. And so taking that as inspiration, I, in Sad Love, in my book Sad Love, I wanted to kind of get into ideas about what that could mean in a contemporary setting. So what would it mean to live a good-spirited life or to love in a good-spirited way? And so I started thinking about, spirits, daimons, potentially metaphorically. So, something like the spirit of a place, or so somebody could be your fairy godmother and be a good daimon to you that way. Maybe they help you get together with your partner and they're eudaimonic for your relationship. But it's much bigger than that. It could be things like zeitgeists. It could be something as grand as global capitalism. That could be a good or bad daimon, depending on your opinion of global capitalism. It could be something like the climate in the place where you live. That could be a good or bad daimon for yourself, for your life, and certainly for your relationships. Ooh, we're going way too fast. So when I think about what it means to live a good-spirited life, eudaimonic life, or to love in a eudaimonic way, I'm thinking about what these good daimons might be. They could be kind people, the people in the relationship and other people. It takes a village, something that I've often said, it takes a village to be in love, not only to raise a child. There's a reason we invite lots of people to wedding ceremonies. They're supposed to be the community that supports the couple getting married, right? Healthy environments, the influences, the communities, our support networks, those can all be good or bad daimons. Well, I guess the people could be bad daimons. If they're kind, they're good ones. And, trying to focus all of our attention on the individual level, like just the people who are going into a relationship, is a way of directing our attention away from those broader factors that influence who and how we end up loving. It's another way of focusing attention on the individuals to the exclusion of society. But living eudaimonically and loving eudaimonically can also involve being a good daimon to others. And this, to me, evokes the idea of belonging, whether or not we are in a romantic relationship ourselves, seeing ourselves as belonging not just to a picket fence family, but to an expansive network of community and care that looks out beyond just that nuclear unit and can include the other people around us, the other people that we work with maybe, other people in our extended family, other people who might just need our help sometimes, other people that we influence by speaking a certain way in whatever context, where someone can overhear us and get a very clear impression of what we're thinking by the terminology that we use. So I'm emphasizing interconnectedness here. This is very intentional. I think that, again, following Viktor Frankl here, we find meaning in connection, in collaboration and creation. And meaning, according to Frankl, is the thing that makes life worth living. It's not happiness. Remember I said he was a survivor of a concentration camp, and he worked in psychiatry. He was working while he was in the camp. He was trying to keep his fellow prisoners alive, mentally well enough to stay alive. And when he says it's not happiness that makes life worth living, it's meaning, he's reporting on his direct experiences there in a situation where happiness was off the table, to say what would make the difference between the people who survived and the people who did not survive. And it was whether they had a meaning in their lives. And what that meaning looked like was something bigger than themselves. A family, a person, a project, something that they knew needed them to continue. So when I think about eudaimonic love, I'm thinking about the interconnectedness of all of these different factors, the society around us, the attitudes around us, but also the fact that we have agency, we have some kind of control over how we perform love. And this is part of being a good daimon, right? Being a good daimon to other people, to our partners perhaps, to other people we love. And this is where I get into this idea of love crafting, which means just basically co-creating our own narratives of love, our own love stories. We don't have to take the off-the-peg fairy tale. Most of us are not going to be able to do that anyway. Right? We have a lot of control. We talk as if love is something that you fall into, right? Like it's a hole in the ground and you're stepping along happily one day, whoops, in you go. And you have no control over anything that happens in that situation. But the reality is, and I think we're noticing this more and more as we notice that, most people are meeting each other on websites where they've gone deliberately looking for someone, and they have a lot of agency and choice and control over who they meet and whether they see the person more than once. We actually have a lot of choice, a lot of control when it comes to love. And it's about doing something rather than about feeling something. I'm not the first person to say this either. Actually, bell hooks is one of my major influences in this part of my theorizing. But I want to flag something that's important here. So when I say it's not about feeling something, that means it's not about feeling happy all the time, which is good, because you can be sad and still be in love. But it doesn't mean that you ignore your feelings. When I say that there's value or wisdom in the negative emotions, that can mean that sometimes you need to listen to them. Actually, I think most of the time we need to listen to them, pay attention to them, and know that sometimes they're a suggestion that things need to change. So the romantic idea is that love is an ever-fixed mark, right? Looks on tempest and is never shaken. Absolutely will not change under any circumstances. That idea of love is what keeps people in abusive relationships and ones that they have just outgrown. Whereas love that pays attention to the important information conveyed by negative feelings, right, that encourages us to examine them and look at where they're coming from, that is a kind of love that allows for the fact that sometimes you got to go. A love like this is, of its nature, always a work in progress and always subject to change. That is a very unromantic thing to say, and I'm okay with that. This is one of the ways that I am really wanting to challenge romantic ideas. There's also some empirical research about this stuff that suggests it hurts more to think about a romantic relationship, as the way people talk about twin flames or other halves, right? Two parts of a puzzle that fit together. If you think about it that way, and then there's a challenge in your relationship, that's evidence that you actually aren't a good fit. Right? If you instead think about relationship as a journey with ups and downs, thinking about a challenge is just one of those hills you get over together. Right? It doesn't hurt the relationship as much. And I don't know exactly how they managed to research this, but I guess somehow they do it. This is something that matters just on a day-to-day life for our own experience, as well as for our bigger, grander philosophical ideas about what love is and what it could be. So yes, very unromantic. But ultimately, I think love, if it's alive, if it's a living thing, I think it should grow and it should change. So living a eudaimonic life then, zooming out again from love for just a second, I think that includes making room for the negative emotions. It includes sad love, and knowing that sad love is not necessarily a dramatic and tragic failure. This is a lesson that's actually common from parenthood, but we don't tend to carry it across to other kinds of loving relationships. Again, empirically, statistically, if you survey parents, especially new parents, first few years of the kid's life, their happiness levels are not great. They are not great. But if you were to ask them if they regret their decision to have their children, they typically say absolutely not. And it's because what they value about that is not their own personal happiness. They don't want to get up feeling that the hills are alive with the sound of music every morning. It's much more meaningful than that. There's something deeper and more important that they are doing, even though they're not experiencing the happiness. Making room for negative emotions also includes, again, speaking from my experience a bit here, doing meaningful work that is not necessarily a fun time. Not only, stuff that can draw some pretty nasty public attention towards you. But to be honest, I'm actually a massive introvert, and standing in front of large groups of people for extended periods is hard for me, but really meaningful. Right? And I know that this is something that, while it's not necessarily the most fun in the world for me, I'm going to feel good about having done it afterwards. And it includes understanding the wisdom of things like anger. Anger is our emotion that typically signals some injustice is being done. Injustice is really important to see when it's happening. My fellow philosopher Maisha Cherry does some excellent work on the philosophy of anger, those who are interested. So making room for this ideas of sad love doesn't mean you stay in relationships that are making you sad, that are abusive or damaging to you. But it does mean there are other ways to evaluate a relationship than happiness. You can look for support in your meaningful projects, for collaboration, for creativity. When I was sad, my partners could have told me to give up the work I was doing, right? Go back to doing the philosophy of arithmetic. That never made you sad. They could have done that, and it wouldn't have actually been a very loving thing to do, because the work that I was doing was meaningful, it was important to me, and their support for me, knowing that it was going to make me sad, was how I was able to interpret this as a kind of loving support. So that's the difference. So okay, little summary, and then I'll wrap up. So romantic love. This is what does tell you you're locked into abusive relationships, right? It's passive. It happens to you. You fall in it. You have no choice. It's static. It's fated, or it's forever, typically both. Again, the soulmate, the other half. You can blame Plato's Symposium, actually, for some of those ideas of the other half. He started it. The goal of romantic love is to become happy ever after. Its alignment is it looks inward. You picture a romantic couple. Go do a Google image search. They're looking at each other. They're together with just each other. And so the configuration that goes with this is the monogamous, heteronormative marriage and nuclear family. So there's a lot about this that I want to criticize, and it doesn't always win me many friends. But the model that I want to promote as a, I guess, more healthy, more viable life goal is eudaimonic love. Eudaimonic love is not defined by happiness. It doesn't have to involve romance, but it might. It's not ruling it out, but it doesn't have to. It's not passive, it's active. It's something you choose to do and you choose to keep doing over time. It's what philosophers might call agential. Your own agency as a person is implicated. And it is not static, it is dynamic. It will change. That's okay. Its aim has nothing to do with happiness. Its aim is meaningful collaboration. That, according to Viktor Frankl, and I agree with him, is what makes life worth living. The idea of eudaimonic love is that, yes, it might be a love between a romantic couple. That can absolutely happen. But it doesn't direct all of our attention just onto the one other person. It calls our attention to the fact that that relationship happens in a much broader context of daimons, spirits of a good and bad kind, of all scales, from the global patriarchy to the little voice in your head telling you you're not good enough for this person. All of those things are interconnected, and this notion of love calls our attention to all of that at once. It's a bit challenging, hard to think of all of that at once. And the configuration, as I said, doesn't have to be a couple. It could be. It could also be what people sometimes call, and I don't actually like this word, a throuple. There's 3 people in a romantic relationship, but they're otherwise a bit coupley. It could be other forms of non-monogamy, right? You really get to choose your own adventure with this. It can be a life that doesn't have a romantic relationship in it at all, because the kinds of eudaimonic love that you enjoy and practice have nothing to do with romance. There are ways to have a eudaimonic life full of eudaimonic love without having a partner. And the other thing about it is it's allowed to end. There is, there we go. There's this lovely poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay, and it ends with these lines. After all, my erstwhile dear, my no longer cherished, need we say it was not love, now that love is perished? Right, so romantic love, if it ends, it's a failure because it was meant to be forever. And if it ends, there's something that was wrong with it. Whereas eudaimonic love, it's allowed to end. If and when the time comes, it's not a failure. There needn't have been anything wrong with it because it ended. And speaking of things that are allowed to end, this talk is one of them. If you do want to find more about me, here's my website. Again, thank you so much for coming out tonight and for listening. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say in the Q&A. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And as you rightly say, it's time for some questions and answers. So over to you. Please put your hands up if you've got a question. Yes, right at the back.
Mine. Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Aidan. Hello.
So the reaction you outlined at the start seems, in a way which you didn't really talk about, very gendered. So I think it has been in your case, and it has been in cases like Simone de Beauvoir, and people have advocated for polyamory. Not that men don't get reactions, as we saw from Russell, but it does seem to be gendered. Now, I was wondering, the kind of story you're telling about the political challenge inherent in all this feels like it doesn't really kind of capture that gendered aspect. So I was wondering if you had something to say. I can think of it might just be combining with misogyny, or it might be to do with particular ideals around motherhood and the nuclear family. But I was just wondering if you could say more about maybe the gendered aspect of that kind of negative reaction.
Thanks so much. You're 100% right, and it's extremely gendered. So somewhere in my first book, I talked about this, what I call the stud versus slut phenomenon. So a non-monogamous man under the kind of, patriarchal heteronormative value system that we all live under is a stud. A woman doing exactly the same thing. Well, there are lots of words for women like that. I've been called most of them many times. Is this microphone sounding weird? No. Okay. It's sounding a little, okay. As long as folks can hear me, that's okay. But that's just a kind of microcosm of it, right? So again, you look under the hood of why is that? And what you get down to is that love, for at least thousands of years, has been seen as women's business. So we can talk about Plato again now. I'm really glad to get back to him. In the symposium, there are several theories of love. One is the soulmates, other halves theory. That goes by in the first half. But then when we get to the really detailed theory, the one that Plato gives to Socrates, and was supposed to be like the most developed, let's say, but probably the right one, Socrates says he learned it from a woman, Diotima. And that's a really weird thing that scholars have been writing ever since. Like, why on earth is a woman given credit for the theory of love that gets the most attention in this dialogue? So, okay, from then on, at least from then on, probably from long before, love and some gendered ideas have been going hand in hand. When we think about Valentine's Day and the pink frilly fripperies that start to show up all over our local card shop, it's gendered, right? That's women's business, and rom-coms are chick flicks, right? And so not only are we supposed to think like women are the ones who really care about this, but also they're kind of the ones who are responsible for it. They're the ones who are responsible for ensuring that it carries on in a good way. Men can kind of do whatever they want, and if they do, they're a bit of a stud. Women are the ones whose monogamy really gets policed. And you can find lots of different possible explanations for that. If you like evolutionary psychology, you'll get explanations having to do with paternity certainty. If you like other kinds of ways of thinking about it, you can read, I think it's Schopenhauer, it says that it's really unnatural for women to be unfaithful. So they just really shouldn't do it. If they do it, it's very, which again, the more recent empirical research suggests that is not in fact the case. There is not a very significant gender difference at all when it comes to preferences for monogamy or non-monogamy, once you abstract away from the social pressures that women feel to say that they would rather be monogamous. So I see all of this as colored by misogyny, by patriarchy, and in ways that are that they go about as deep as there is to go. So yeah, I appreciate the invitation to say more about it. But the way it manifests is very direct, very kind of obvious if you're a woman saying this stuff. Bertrand Russell was never called any of those kinds of names.
Yes. Wait for the mic. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. So I was wondering about meaning in this context, because meaning is very individual. And when we're talking about meaning in a couple relationship or more than a couple, what does that exactly mean? And is it like a shared cause you're working towards? And if so, like how do you differentiate that from community causes or like other types of love that has meaning?
On that last point, how do you differentiate it? You probably don't. So one of my not very hidden agendas is to dethrone the idea that romantic love is special, different, like a really unique or distinct kind of love. You're absolutely right. Meaning is I cannot tell you how to live a meaningful life because it entirely depends on what you're going to find meaningful. All I can tell you, and this again comes from what I've learned by reading people much wiser than me talk about it, is that it tends to be things that look beyond the self, right? Meaning tends to come from collaboration with others, from creativity, creative acts, and things that are just a bit bigger than making yourself happy. How do you differentiate it from other kinds of community projects? I don't think there's a different. So I'm intentionally using the word eudaimonic for both a good love and a good life, because I think they're both structured by the same things. These meaningful goals, these creative acts. Whether they are one person's. Okay, two scenarios. A couple where one person is a great nuclear physicist and the other one is really keen on their garden, right? Now, the gardener may not be able to help with the physics and vice versa, but what they can really do is support the other person in their pursuit of that meaningful goal. That's scenario number one. Scenario number two, they're both gardeners and they do the garden together. Both of those could be ways of having eudaimonic love, right? The goals could be shared or they could be individual, but what matters is, are the people who love each other supporting, collaborating, getting each other towards their goals? Do you see what I mean? Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah, and it opens so many more questions.
Oh yes, that's how philosophy always works.
We four rows back over towards that side of the room.
Thank you. I'm thinking about the point how political, economical linking to the endorsement of romantic love. The way I interpret it is people being working age population is just the source of GDP, right? So if the world really embrace, the commitment to net zero climate change, do you think that may give the eudaimonic love, the chance to be endorsed by politicians?
If yes, possibly, at least it would be a step in a good direction, because the kind of thing that's required to embrace a goal like that, seriously embrace it, like for real, the kind of thing that's required is a way of seeing value, right? What is the point of a life? What is valuable about humanity as a species that is a million miles away from the capitalistic informed ideology where it's individualistic, it's about personal gain, it's about what you can accumulate. There are other ways of seeing the world, other, entire philosophies, worldviews, where what we do is evaluated on very different grounds, and those grounds have to do with understanding our connectedness to the entire ecosystem that we live and have to survive within. Those ways of understanding ourselves and our actions and our lives are much more conducive to living eudaimonically, and I think would also be conducive to really thoroughly endorsing the kinds of goals that are ultimately going to be necessary for us to stay alive. Yes, I think so. I think these things are connected. And that idea of interconnectedness is really the hinge, right? Understanding that love doesn't happen in a vacuum is like understanding that our business decisions do not happen in a vacuum. Our political leadership doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's all very deeply connected in ways that, ecologists are a little better at understanding than politicians are sometimes.
Okay, so let's one and then two, please.
I think what you're saying is marvellous. However, people don't live in just a bubble. There's usually other people in the extended family, children. The pressure may come from children, especially with children mixing with other children. And also, dare I say it, there is probably going to be pressure from the mother-in-laws, how they react with each other. Can two mothers-in-law get on with each other? There could be.
I've heard tell, but you're quite right. And what's fascinating is that children can actually be the most socially conservative creatures on the planet. And it's fascinating because it tells you how early the ideology that we see in these, playing out on these grand scales later, how early it gets in there. Again, it's bringing it back to the connection with gender. By the time, my nephews were 3-4 years old, they were already very secure about, this is boy stuff, this is girl stuff. Girls don't play with these, boys do, And these ideas are actually, the children can have very firm opinions because they're just learning the rules for the first time, right? So they haven't yet gotten the extra layer of, do I think these are good rules, bad? Or they're just, so you often see it out of the mouths of babes, right? You often see things the most clearly when a child says it. Yes, the pressures to conform, I suppose that's what you're thinking, right? These pressures to conform with our lives and our relationships, they come from every direction, including, sometimes the call is coming from inside the house as well, right? We internalize this and then we judge ourselves for acting differently. But yes, mothers-in-law, every kind of extended family member. When I started being honest about being in non-monogamous relationships, I lost some connections with family, and it was very sad. I lost friends, and it was because I was fortunate enough to be in a position to say, I'm doing it anyway, that I was able to do it anyway. But not everybody is, and it's really important to acknowledge that too. I'm not sort of, I never want it to be part of anyone's takeaway from me talking about what I do, that they should do something. Because what people should do depends on so many other factors, including all of those pressures. A lot of people are scared that if they say they're non-monogamous, their kids will be taken away. They're scared that they'll lose their jobs if people know, right? This is real stuff. And it very much depends where you are located in the world. So I I now live in Vancouver, which is relatively, you know, on a global scale, a very liberal city. And I'm a tenured professor, so my job is relatively secure, but relatively secure. So I have a position which is honestly what I'm talking about there is I'm talking about privilege. I have the kinds of privilege that enable me to go and do these things and talk about it. And so did Bertrand Russell, actually. So, a member of the aristocracy. He had other kinds of privilege going for him as well. And enables us to go around and do these things and say these things. And when those pressures come in, to resist them to a certain extent. It is not that way for everybody. And some people, if you are living with your mother-in-law and she is paying all your bills and feeding you, you can't afford to lose her good opinion, and that's the way it is.
Okay, in the front row.
Thank you. I've absolutely loved it this evening. I could just be here all evening. Thank you so much. I'm fascinated by the etymology, and I took a photo of it, so I'm not remembering it. It's on my phone here. And I'm fascinated in an international context because I'm wondering, just speculating, whether supernatural entity or spirit and good-spirited will mean totally different things in different cultural contexts, different countries, different parts of countries, linguistically different, just historically, culturally, philosophically. And I'd love to just revel in all of that. And I wondered how much you've explored that and how much you'd love to explore that more.
I have only just recently started, but I am completely fascinated by what little I know so far, to learn more about the indigenous worldviews of the colonial lands that I live on now. So I live on territory that is stolen from indigenous peoples in what's colonially known as Vancouver. So it's the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And all around what we call British Columbia, there's a fascinating, diverse, but in some respects unified group of worldviews. And I'm only recently starting to learn and understand better, which is, you know, I'm ashamed of because I've lived there for 10 years and I should have started right away. But you know, ideology being what it is, I wasn't aware that they even existed. Actually, my partner Robin helps. He is teaching me and introducing me to a lot of this kind of knowledge and wisdom. But there's ways of seeing the world, especially understandings of what interconnectedness really means, like how very deep that goes, that are built into indigenous worldviews in such a way that they're built right into the languages that are spoken, so that it's so obvious. And it's not something you have to kind of work your way slowly and gradually back to with a series of complicated arguments. You just start there. It's baseline. So for me to say something like, you know, living and loving in a good-spirited way is very important would be like, well, duh, you know. And there are, and I'm just, so, and this is just one example, of course, but what you're saying is absolutely right, that this talk of supernatural entities is going to be interpreted very differently. In some ways, I think that's a feature rather than a bug, because I kind of want it to be interpretable in very different ways. Like, I also want this to be available to someone who has no metaphysical belief in supernatural entities, right? So you can read it all as metaphors and say it's like, when we talk about the office climate, we don't mean it's literally raining. We mean that the people are a bit chilly, you know, metaphorically. Or when we talk about a fairy godmother, we're not really talking about wings and a tutu. We're just saying that they do nice things. So they're good-spirited in a sense that you can have a thoroughly scientific and materialistic worldview and still understand it that way as well. So yes, I think these kinds of differences in how to interpret and understand eudaimonia are, I think, as long as they lead to the same results, all well and good. I would have to be, I would have to have an encyclopedic knowledge that I'm not close to having to anticipate where that could go wrong, where interpretations of this could take you in like a different direction. There probably are some, but I don't know of any yet. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, towards the back.
Thanks very much. Thank you for a fantastic lecture. Really enjoy that. Challenging social norms and expectations comes with a certain level of discomfort when people are exposed to it. And I was wondering if you, in your work, found a way of mitigating that discomfort and kind of so people could understand that this is normal, this is perfectly acceptable to feel that way, and how, are there any other ways to mitigate that, to make to make people feel that, you know, this is a natural way of progress?
What's interesting. It's not exactly mitigating, but maybe it comes with some mitigating consequences. When, again, like statistical, empirical research into what makes people change their minds on something like this, it's not usually abstract theoretical argumentation. It's not even statistics. It's usually stories, and usually stories about someone they know or someone who's like people they know. So it's why I talk about myself, actually. I guess it's partly mitigating some of the discomfort because someone can see me, like this sort of boring middle-aged professor type woman, and think, oh, but she looks so boring and normal. and even she has done something like this. And that's, you know, it's one way in. The other kind of thing that really works is, when people come across these, this is very much actually, I think, the way that attitudes to queer relationships have changed over the, I guess, 20 or so years since when, you know, I was a teenager in the 90s, and I could have absolutely never imagined being able to say, yes, I'm bi, it's no big deal, in front of like a large group of people. And now I do it often, and it's fine. And the idea that same-sex marriage would be a reality by the time I was in my mid-40s was just mind-blowing. And the way that change has happened, I think, is very largely through people knowing that they know people who are not straight. Before, they knew people who were not straight, they just didn't know that they knew. And I think this is just sort of, it's happening a little bit with other kinds of challenges to the romantic ideal norms. It's not always a straight progression, and sometimes, unfortunately, one thing that happened in the advancement of queer rights was that non-monogamy got thrown under the bus a little bit by queer people trying to say, we're just like you straight people because we're also monogamous, and we would also like to get monogamously married and be respectable. And so this is part of why I say respectability is a kind of double-edged word, because it's always going to be drawing a line between the ins and the outs, right? Someone's going to be the not respectable crowd left over. And unfortunately, for like the last 20 or so years, the non-monogamous people were kind of that crowd. So what's starting to happen more now, and since I started talking about this, I've seen it shifting because of, you know, a lot of us are starting to have these conversations not having before. And now more people know that they know someone who is not monogamous, whereas before they knew them, but they didn't know that they were non-monogamous. And so that's kind of really the best kind of mitigating, or the best way of alleviating the discomfort, I think, that I know of, is to find out that it's just real boring people that do it. And you can sort of, you know, once you know it's more about who's going to pick the kids up and collect the laundry and do, you know, walk the dog, and less about like wild orgies every Thursday night, then it makes a lot more sense. And I say that, you know, with a passing comment, which I'll add, that the other thing that can then tend to happen is that then the people who are having wild orgies every Thursday night are the ones being thrown under the bus, because there's also a way of being negative about that kind of lifestyle, which honestly, as long as you're not doing anyone any harm, is also totally fine. So this is what I mean by saying, like, respectability. It's a difficult word under which to navigate these conversations. But that's a slightly rambly answer. The short version is it's about knowing people. It's knowing people's stories. That's what mitigates the discomfort, I think. Yeah.
Okay, I can see 2 hands. So let's start over on that side of the room, please.
Thank you. So eudaimonic goals are something that we could go after as individuals or in couples or thruples or however we want to achieve that. But presumably that is facilitated by living in a eudaimonic supporting society. But the thing that mitigates against that is the society being one that pushes the constraints of resources and the constraints of power and that belonging in places.
Yeah.
And the rise of right-wing or fascist governments is something that is preventing
Yes.
people living eudaimonic lives. And we can see that eudaimonia is something that is processed and reasoned, and perhaps fears is something that's very often not processed and not reasoned, and that's why it's quite easy to, I could scream, I could jump, I could shout fire, and everybody would respond to that, not in a reasoned way, but in a very quick way. So how do we develop societally in a way that allows a eudaimonic response to somebody who's trying to do an instinctive to give you an instinctive feeling that actually there are constraints, there are limits, you have to worry, you have to get your own piece of this, which is anti-eudaimonic.
We're a wee bit short of time, so I'd like to get that. You sure?
Yes, okay.
You can ask your question if you keep it quick, and we can have.
I'll try to get 2 in 1.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's somewhat related. Sorry, I can't see you. Hi.
Okay.
My thoughts around all of these is in a similar line of being like, at some point during your research and your reading and your formulating these questions and answers, obviously you were also talking about how romantic love, as we understand it nowadays, is very tied to the system that we live in, the patriarchy, heteronormity, etc. Do you at some point ask yourself if there's a more natural, like biologically natural way that we would act if we weren't subjected to these? And especially when you were speaking about indigenous peoples around the world, we know that their sense of interconnectedness with the ecosystem and the land and the animals and so on would seem to suggest that naturally left in our natural devices, we would tend more to that as opposed to, or you just do not go there at all, which is also understandable.
Yeah.
If you could try and address both, and unfortunately we better make that the last.
Absolutely,
reply.
yeah. I think I can synthesize the 2 answers that I would give into something along the lines of, well, yes, the constraints that we live under are absolutely, they are either good or bad, positive or negative influences, good or bad daimons. If you are living in the US, Donald Trump has come along and just been this incredibly bad daimon, and that now everything is affected by that, and it does limit what we can do. How can we change that? I mean, not one of us cannot do it individually, but everything is connected, so anything that we do has an effect, and things that we all are doing individually eventually add up. Right? So that is how the only way that can possibly work. Whether we're, what I say about things like the state of nature or what comes naturally to humans is that what's natural to us is diversity of approach. So what is natural to the species, what is exceptional, remarkable, unusual about humans is they try all kinds of different strategies. When they face a problem, they'll try all different strategies, right? And things like how to live in a social group, how to raise children, those are problems, and they will try different strategies for solving those problems. And so I'm hesitant to say any one of the solutions is natural, because I think really it's in our nature to keep trying as many different strategies as possible. Hope that answered both of those questions.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you for patiently answering so many questions, and apologies to those of you who had questions, but sadly we're timed out. But thank you, Carrie, above all, for a really fascinating evening's lecture.
Thank you so much. Those were great questions, by the way. You're so welcome.